the content of my presentation, I will give a brief introduction of the topic. I will then go on to talk about the different ayahuasca universes. It's how I split the different kind of environments where you can take ayahuasca, the risks that are within each of these different universes, the regulatory attempts using a case study of the ESC and the opposition, and then the findings of my research that I discovered through interviews and discourse analysis, and how I apply a theory of fields towards the topic. So we have an increase in demand of ayahuasca due to the ayahuasca boom in the last decades, due to the increase of research both in medical, in religious studies like Ayahuasca project that Dennis McKenna did. And all of these highlights the benefits and uses of ayahuasca in each of the universes. Now, the paper uses a sociological perspective and a qualitative method like interviews and discourse analysis. And the conclusions is that there is an underlying political problem within the ayahuasca community that prevents the indigenous communities and everybody involved in the scene of ayahuasca to benefit from potential kind of fruits that regulatory attempts can bring. Now, these are the ayahuasca universes I've kind of separated. You can have ayahuasca uses through medical, so the medical universe focuses of all of the medical research done, for example, by MAPS, so getting FDA approvals to do ayahuasca and all the psychedelic research in the US and abroad. Under the religious universe, you have the Santo Daime and UDV churches, Brazilian churches that take ayahuasca as the sacrament. Under the traditional shamanic, you have the use of ayahuasca in a very traditional context within the Amazon. Then you have a similar but different, which is called the neo-shamanic use. You can have this both within the Amazon and outside of the Amazon. So this is all the retreat centers in Iquitos that are kind of for Western travelers or even mestizo Latin American people to go and have a kind of shamanic experience. You can also have this abroad, like in Holland, in Portugal, and different places, even in the UK, but it's kind of underground due to the legality. So as you can see, the kind of table that all these different bubbles or universes sit at is the legal status of ayahuasca, which internationally is prohibition. So making proud the previous speaker, I'm not going to say the regulation of ayahuasca, the regulation of the use of ayahuasca. And this brings out a universe which is the policy universe. So countries like Canada that are using ayahuasca or guidelines towards public health, they focus more on the benefit maximization and reduction of harm rather than legalization or decriminalization. So these are kind of models that we could borrow in other countries that have shown to be successful. And last but not leastly, the psychonautic universe, kind of like consciousness, self-exploration through the use of psychedelics, say at home or where there's perhaps a lack of setting or context where you have an oversight of, say, a therapist or a shaman or a guidance on this trip. Now, there's different risks that arise within each of the universes. It could be from unqualified people claiming expertise. Lately, we've seen a lot of kind of new shamans that emerged from one day to another, claiming that they have the years of experience of being trained as a shaman. Most of these things happen because, from 10 years till now, tourists would come to the Amazon and would pay a lot of money for an ayahuasca ceremony, which wouldn't happen before. Now, if you consider the economic and social aspect of countries like Peru, Colombia, Brazil, or the Amazon basin, where there is a lot of inequality, you bring all this kind of income and economics of ayahuasca, let's say. It's a commodity that's in high demand. You come, you demand a lot of it, and the price increases. And obviously, people that are in need will use this as a means of generating income, or next day, oh, I'm a shaman as well, I can charge a gringo $2,000 for a retreat. So that's that kind of risk. Within the medical setting, we have the decontextualization of the spirituality aspect of ayahuasca. So kind of stripping it down from its historical and cultural context, which is shamanism and spirituality, and making it just laboratory-based kind of white coat synthesized pharmahuasca, as they call it. Within the religious, you can also experience kind of people claiming certain titles under the churches, and hybridities of ayahuasca. So for example, they really have like a measure of how to brew it. In other places you may not have this. So like in the psychonautic universe, you may encounter people that order it online, cook it themselves, and the brew might be completely different. Another risk within any of these universes is thinking that ayahuasca is a magic pill, so and a panacea, that it will cure your depression, your PTSD on the first moment, and that you don't have to integrate or integrate all of these insights that you've seen on your regular life or your daily life. So the integration and the lack of integration process is a very important kind of topic here. Then we have another type of risk, which is the other side of the mirror, which is foreigners coming into the Amazon and with the lack of education about culture and kind of seeing this romanticized idea of culture. Oh yeah, they're happy there, there's no depression, there's no stress, we're just going to go into completely disconnected society with no Wi-Fi. But when you go, you actually encounter social inequalities, cultural issues and aspects, and risks of cultural appropriation. Now, these are all kind of risks towards the safety of the participants or the safety of the culture itself, but you also encounter risks that are in relation to the plant itself, which are the sustainability issues with the vine. So increased demand, increased harvesting reduces the actual supply of ayahuasca. And how risk regulation emerges as a solution for these risks through information gathering, standard setting, and behavioral modification. Now, when I mean risk regulation, I want to make a clear distinction between regulation does not equal prohibition or criminalization, because a lot of people think that, regulating the use of ayahuasca means kind of prohibiting it. It's completely the opposite. It's allowing it to be legal, but regulating the process of supply, the use, the medical screening, having guidelines, and having different sorts of, not controlling, but improving the use of it. So the three pillars of risk regulation are laid there. And I'm giving a brief example of what that means. So information gathering can be done through research, through interviews, through surveys, standard setting, and through that you find out what you already have, what is good, and what is missing, so how you can improve. Through standard setting is basically creating guidelines, creating best practices, self-regulation measures, so having a retreat center that is not overseen by anybody, but in fact they have their own guidelines of, okay, I'm not going to accept you unless you give me your whole brief of medical history. Do you have any depression? Have you been on antidepressants? Because as you may be aware of, combining these two can have health problems or consequences. And it's kind of setting the bar. So an example would be within the religious universe, like the Santo Daime already has this kind of regulation within them. They have a specific way of brewing ayahuasca, and if it's not done through that kind of regime, then it's not a Santo Daime practice, for example. And as a consequence of these two things, then you have behavioral modification. So you improve the practice or the process, and then you continue towards a less risky kind of practice of ayahuasca. Now, the regulatory challenges that I mentioned, I took as a case study, a case that happened on the 2014. We have the ESC, which is the Ethnobotanical Stewardship Council, an NGO that was trying to improve the safety of the participants, trying to improve the sustainability of the vine, and trying to ensure fair remuneration towards the suppliers. Because a lot of problems arise when you have someone sourcing ayahuasca for a very little amount of money, then selling it abroad or within the Amazon in this kind of Westerner retreat center for thousands of whatever currency, dollar, euro, but actually giving back to the local producer or the indigenous producer a very little amount compared to what they actually charge for. So these were kind of the three main aims of the ESC, and they were doing it through this kind of standard setting, information gathering. So they were creating dialogues with all these different stakeholders, so the healers, the farmers, indigenous groups, scientists, experts. They had Dennis McKenna as a special advisor and member of the board. Joshua Wickerham was the founder and CEO. They also had Jack Davis from DPA, Drug Policy Alliance, within the board member. And they were sponsored by MAPS and ICEERS, if you know about them. Now, this all sounds great, right? Like, who would be opposing to such a kind of like legitimate effort towards improving the ayahuasca scene? So there was a group of 60 plus academics and experts who were against the ESC aims and goals on the right-hand side, and they came together to put a statement on critique. Obviously, there's like 10 pages of it. You can find it online. I've only just put this for reference. But their main arguments was that the ESC was raising alarmist campaigns and saying that we need to sanitize the Amazon, and that this is a completely imported idea coming from the West. So basically, in other words, this is a completely capitalistic idea of profit making using business language like sustainability and guidelines and all these kind of things, where they were against this kind of approach. And they mainly based their claim under we are representing the indigenous communities better. So this saying the ESC should not happen because should not continue doing its work because the indigenous communities need to be better represented. There's lack of indigenous community representation. And other claims such as the retreat centers should not be certified because this can create inequalities. Now, some of the points of the critique are very valid, as well as the points of the ESC. Potentially creating a certification could create inequality. However, all the work that the ESC was doing was based on cooperation, was based on dialogue, including all the stakeholders, so it was very inclusive. Now, the work that the opposition was doing was, I did an analysis that you can find on the paper, where you can see that the majority of the signatories of the critique are anthropologists, are from the anthropology kind of universe, per se. And what I found through the interviews, so I interviewed the ESC founder, Joshua Wickerham, I interviewed Dennis McKenna, I interviewed Jack Davis, as I mentioned, so people that were involved in this whole kind of fight or contention. I interviewed a global North expert who preferred to remain anonymous, and he is a ayahuasca policy expert, kind of to have a middle ground opinion on the topic, so kind of an unbiased opinion. I reached out to members of the opposition, especially the members that were highly opposing to this, and they were all very reluctant to speak about the topic. No one wanted to have an interview with me. They seemed as this was something that we should left untouched, and it already happened in the past, we don't want to talk about it anymore, etc. So this kind of like raised a lot of questions of why are we not talking about this? Like, what is happening here if these were kind of legitimate attempts to improve the ayahuasca scene? And then a couple of more like lay public participants, such as a clinical psychologist that owns also a retreat center in Holland, and Wigert, who is a user of more than 100 ceremonies, both within the Amazon, with Honeyqueen tribe in Brazil, so a very shamanic practice, and also a neo-shamanic practice in Holland. And the discourse analysis that I did was through the kind of guidelines that the ESC had presented back then, the statement of critique of the opposition, and the non-public emails that were coming back and forth during the episode of contention between these two groups. Now, I wasn't considering the emails to start with. It was only after interviewing all these people that they voluntarily gave me evidence of all the kind of contention episode and mentioning when the ESC was raising all these funds to fund the project, the opposition saw it as a kind of threat, as a battle for grants, if you want to call it this way, and triggered people that are very influential in the ayahuasca scene, both in the academic anthropology world and the media world, to fight back and see this as a threat and kind of and dismantle the ESC. So this resulted in the dissolution of the ESC. Now, it's really important to mention that these people were initially part of the ESC. They share the vision, they share the goals. They just changed their mind along the way. And this raises a lot of questions as into why. So part of the findings are, as I mentioned, two different ideologies, kind of an ideology of improving the safety of participants, improving the sustainability, and the fair remuneration, so the NGO vision of risk regulation of the use of ayahuasca, and then a view of indigenous representation and anti-cultural appropriation done by anthropology world. Now, we can see that there was a collaboration that was based on coercion to sign the letter of the signatories, to mobilize resources and the whole anthropologist community to be against the ESC. I analyzed this through the theory that I'll mention later, a theory of fields, where you can see incumbents and challengers of a particular field. What I found through the interview is that it kind of resembled a monopoly. It seemed like the ayahuasca academic community had a coalition of sorts, like if you couldn't really enter it, because there were already big players on the spotlight. And if you would take their light away from them, it would create an issue, which is kind of really weird when you talk about something as spiritual, as beneficial as ayahuasca. All this, you want to create awareness. We're having these conferences, and then you hear these type of cases, and it seems almost like a paradigm. Now, the juicy stuff is when I got hold of these emails, and obviously it's covered for confidentiality purposes, except for the ESC director, Josh, who obviously was receiving all these attacks in a personal way. So it instead of being I'm against your aims, it started being I'm against you. So we can see that the strategic action from the opponents was a little bit kind of hierarchical. So things like the stupendous delusion of the ESC, you have a sheer mania, arrogance, delusion. I think this is a Messianic blindness, etc. So this person here has a high influential power in the ayahuasca scene. As you can see in purple, there's a lot of person targeting and demeaning and dismissive language and threatening. So it's saying, I'm just going to read to you, all the media, so here's my personal bottom line. I get loads of high profile media all the time, ABC, CNN, New York Times, Fox, etc. All the media I'm currently getting enables me to address issues that potentially harm the ayahuasca community. And the ESC is one of those issues. So here's a heads up. I'm going to directly, explicitly take this issue on and highlight the ESC as a wrong-headed, fundamentally corrupt idea that can cause lasting damage to all of us. I'll take the opportunity to speak out against this. I'm sharpening my verbal machinery right now. And we'll diligently work towards its demise, just so you know. So as you can see, this kind of makes you be scared about, like, I'm here presenting this and now I'm thinking, oh my God, is somebody going to come and chase me afterwards for showing you guys this. So here we go to kind of like the boring side of things or the academic side of things, which is, okay, how all of this fits into a certain model of sociology, right? And believe me, when I was doing my research and proposing this at London School of Economics, people thought I was going mental. Why are you here if you want to talk about a psychedelic medicine or drug or whatever they were calling it? And so this was what I used to kind of tailor the topic within it and make it a successful dissertation. So the strategic action field is like fundamental collective actions in society. So how you organize groups to a collective aim. The incumbents are normally the people that are already within the field, and they fight or collaborate to keep the status quo of a particular scenario. In this case, they are the signatories of the opposition because they did not wanted any new entrants of the field, and they didn't want any change. They wanted it to remain untouched as if it was static in time, right? Then we have the challengers, who was the ESC, new entrants of the field with new ideas, with new improvements, with etc. And internal governance units, in this case, each universe that I've mentioned before, or ICers and MAPs, so organizations that are already doing a lot of work to kind of maintain the order within this. The broader environment is, of course, as we spoke about, the legal status of it, because as much as we all want ayahuasca to be accessible for everybody, we're sitting at the legal table that will require a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of awareness and consciousness awakening from countries and people that are actually in power to be able to change the way it is seen at the moment. Then the social skills, so in this case, collaboration in terms of the ESC and coercion in terms of the signatories. The episode of contention, basically what the problematic, so the kind of fight or the argument between them two, and the shocks, mobilization, and onset of contention. So the ESC being successful with their crowdfunding, the opposition seeing it as a threat, organizing resources, mobilizing, and the settlement, in other words, the dissolution of the ESC. So in conclusion, the collective strategic action of the ESC was based on cooperation, whilst the opposition was based on coercion. This was in order to remain the status quo as it was. And something that's really important to mention is, why are we talking about this 5 years later? Is because, one, the issues persist, the issues haven't gone away, and if anything, they have, the certain risks have increased. So you have now risks of sexual abuse, mental abuse, psychological abuse in certain ceremony contexts. And you have institutes like Chacruna providing the guidelines of community ayahuasca against sexual abuse when, wait a minute, this could have been done 5 years ago. So it's kind of funny that people that were against this back then are now raising the issues as theirs currently. So is this was, you know, it makes you think, well, did you want it to be in the spotlight, or what's the reason behind doing this? Another important thing to mention is that the indigenous representation. So they said we're better suited to represent indigenous communities. However, and I quote Dennis McKenna in his interview, he said they arrogated the political correctness to themselves when it comes to ayahuasca. They did not ask any of the indigenous communities if they wanted to be represented. And so this issue was now thrown under the carpet. The ESC was dissolved, and now 5 years later, things are being raised again. So it is relevant because good governance, it includes everybody, all the stakeholders, and that is something that the ESC was doing. The opposition was very dismissive and was not being inclusive. And it kind of highlights the paradigm of, we want to increase the awareness of ayahuasca. We're having all of these movements and beautiful conferences and things, but at the same time, we want to leave the Amazon untouched. Do not touch it, do not regulate it, leave it static in time, and you cannot have both. They cannot coexist whether you want people to benefit from all the uses and all the potential that ayahuasca and all the psychedelics have, then you have to be open to change, because you need it and you cannot leave it untouched. So I just want you to consider these conclusions that I came up with, and just remember that if you're going to enter the scene, you have to leave the ego out the door. Thank you.